here early, you probably saw some of the technical difficulties, and it's amazing the lengths to which the Russian Secret Service is. They tried to hack Manlius Informed, but we have overcome that technical glitch, and we're ready to go. So I'm here to talk about Russia. As you know, it's not really a big topic in the news these days, but hopefully keep you interested anyway. In terms of ground rules, feel free to interrupt at any point. If I'm not loud enough, louder. Okay, louder, that's the first message. Okay.
Would you just tell us what your background is in Russia and
Sure.
why?
I'm a product of the late Cold War. So when I was an undergrad at the University of Iowa, Ronald Reagan was the US president. And when I started, there was a guy named Leonid Brezhnev who was Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and he was replaced. Well, he died. And then a couple other guys came, and then this guy Gorbachev came along. So I initially got interested in the Soviet Union because of nuclear weapons. I was in the disarmament movement. And then when I went to London to do my master's, things really started to take off with Gorbachev's reforms, and so I got much more interested in the internal politics of studying first the Soviet Union and then Russia. So that's what I did my dissertation on at MIT. Written a couple books about Russia. I go quite a bit for research, but I don't have any family background or anything. Yeah, just an interest. Yeah, I'm actually going in 3 weeks. So anyway, so in terms of ground rules, do one of these if you can't hear me, or if you've got questions as I'm going, feel free to interrupt. I'm not really going to be concerned if I don't get to all my slides. So I'm happy to talk about whatever you guys want. All right. So, as you know, this is the former Secretary of Defense. As you know, Russia has been in the news a lot, really, since the events in Ukraine and Crimea, especially of late 2013, early 2014, and then the war in Ukraine afterwards. And certainly in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, we're at a pretty low point. And Ash Carter was talking last year about how we returned to great power competition, which is something that many of us thought, in the 90s in particular, was something that we'd gone beyond. But we seem to be back where we were in the Cold War, worrying about deterring Russian aggression, and it's something that is occupying a lot of attention, including by lots of people who write on Russia. So if you go to Amazon, or you actually go to an actual bookstore, a physical bookstore, you can find books on the new Cold War, return to Cold War. Everyone's talking about the Cold War, and of course we have our president who, during the campaign, and in fact much before the campaign, was talking about how we could change our relations with Russia. So if we go back even to 2007, so this is not a new thing with Trump, it's something that goes back deeper. Look at Putin. He's doing a great job in rebuilding the image of Russia and also rebuilding Russia, period. And then during the campaign, he was talking about how Putin's been very nice to me. If we can make a great deal for our country and get along with Russia, that would be a tremendous thing. I would love to try it. You may recall that in the previous presidency under Obama at the beginning in 2009, there was also an effort to reestablish good relations with Russia. It was referred to as the reset. The president of Russia at the time was a guy named Dmitry Medvedev. If you all remember Medvedev, yeah? He's still around, he's prime minister now. But we're back to Mr. Putin in the Kremlin. And so there were some expectations during the campaign that if Putin won the election, there would be a shift to a more friendly or accommodating policy towards Russia. That has not happened, at least in the first, what are we at, 109 days? People were keeping track for every day for a while. The first 4 months of the Trump administration in Russia is feeling slighted and wants a reset. And as you probably know, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is in Washington today meeting with President Trump, on top of everything else that's going on in Washington. All right. I love the guy because when I finished my dissertation in 1998, people thought Russia wasn't really a going concern anymore, right? If you can see this guy, it's an expert on Russia panhandling on the street. And that's where I thought I might be. But Vladimir Putin has made Russia interesting and hot again. So today, we're going to talk a bit about why that is so. And I'm going to make two basic points. I'm going to talk about Putin, and I'm going to talk about what I call Putinism. And I'm going to talk about the limits of Russian power. And so the two parts of the talk have two kind of different thematic emphases. So the first part of the talk is going to suggest, let's see if we can keep these bouncing along. There we go. The first part of the talk, these are reversed, but when I talk about Putinism, I'm going to explain why I think that better US-Russian relations are unlikely, and a lot of it has to do with trying to understand the worldview of Vladimir Putin and those people around him, and why they're fairly skeptical of the United States. But when I talk about the limits of Russian power, I'm going to say, well, even though I don't expect great relations, this is very different from the Cold War. Okay? So one emphasis is more kind of on the negative side of relations, but one is telling us to be a bit more cautious. So we have to start by talking about this guy. In Russia, he's Vladimir the Great. On the campaign trail, he's often referred to by people like John McCain, Marco Rubio, and others as a thug, right? So we have a very different view of Vladimir Putin inside Russia and over here. In Russia, his favorability ratings and those people who say they trust Vladimir Putin as president is 72% by recent polls. It used to be even higher than that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How accurate is a poll in Russia?
It's a good question.
And how much is roughly?
Well, you know what? I can say I was just in Russia. My son's living and studying there, and they love him.
It depends on who you ask, right, as with anything. But most social scientists who study polling and study Russia simultaneously think the polls more or less reflect popular opinion, and they've done various tricky experiments with how they do their polls to try and make sure they're uncovering people's true feelings. Now, there's a deeper question, which is what information are they exposed to about him in the Russian media, and especially on Russian television, which may affect how they answer the question.
Right.
And it also affects how they interpret the question, right? But pollsters don't think that people are dissembling because they're afraid, right? So if there's any bias, it comes at a prior stage in the process rather than in the polling itself, I think. If you ask Americans if they have confidence in Russia and Putin to do the right thing, only 21% of Americans say yes. So completely different image of this man over here as opposed to in Russia. And this is probably a cultural reference that maybe not everyone will get, but there's a writer and director named Joss Whedon. He's most famous to me for a TV series called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Anyone ever watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer? A few people. He also directed the Avenger movies. And one of the actors he was working with, a guy named Nathan Fillion, said that Joss Whedon taught him something really important about playing a bad guy in the movies, which is bad guys don't think they're bad guys, right? So although Vladimir Putin is portrayed as a bad guy in the American media and by many American politicians, he obviously doesn't think he's a bad guy, right? He thinks he's doing the right thing for Russia. And so I want to start by talking about why it is he feels that way, or why he does what he does. So I'm going to talk about what I call his code or his mentality, and I'll unpack that a bit as we go. But one of the important messages is that Vladimir Putin thinks that he's playing defense, right? He's portrayed in the American press as being on the offense, being aggressive. He sees himself as responding to threats that are coming at Russia. All right. Is he a pragmatist or is he an ideologue? For a very long time, especially early on in the Putin presidency, so he's been with us since late 99, early 2000, either as president or prime minister, he was often portrayed by American experts as the ultimate pragmatist, someone who was very much thinking rationally about what he can do within the system to move his goals ahead. And that was the dominant image, and to some people is still the dominant image. But especially after the events in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, he started to be portrayed more and more as this kind of extreme Russian nationalist, trying to expand Russian power, expand the limits of Russian power, redo the borders with the annexation of Crimea. So a Russian colleague noted in 2014 that Putin had transformed himself from a pragmatist to an ideologue. And here he's dressed up as if he's Tsar Alexander III. Yes, sir?
Yeah, with regard to the annexation of Crimea, when it was in 1954 that Crimea became part of Ukraine?
Yes, within the boundaries of the Soviet Union, administrative control of Crimea was transferred from the Russian Republic in the Soviet Union, which was made up of 15 republics, to the control of the Ukrainian Republic.
And it was during the reign of Premier Khrushchev?
Yes, it was when Nikita Khrushchev was
But
there.
what was the reasoning behind that?
There were
The Russian thinking?
well, it was really Khrushchev's thinking, right? It was mainly his decision, and there were a couple of reasons behind it. One was political. At the time, this was just a year after Stalin had died, and Khrushchev was trying to consolidate power, and one of his potential allies was a person occupying the position that was called First Secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, like the leader of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Republic within the Soviet Union. And so this was a gesture that was seen as drawing his political support. And the ostensible reason was that this represented the 300th anniversary of a famous treaty, agreement, whatever, between Russian and Ukrainian leaders back in 1654. There also were some economic reasons. As Ukraine was industrializing, Crimea being a peninsula that's attached to Ukraine but not attached to Russia, it was easier for water supply, electricity supply, and other industrial developments to run through Ukraine rather than run through Russia, because there was now, or there was then, and there is now still no bridge between Russia and Crimea, although they are building one at the moment. So there were political reasons and there were economic reasons.
And I won't slow you down anymore, but were there differences in ethnicity between the people who lived in Crimea and the people who lived in Ukraine? I mean, you know, are there differences between Russians and people of Ukraine? I mean,
Sure. So,
and in terms of population in Crimea.
okay, so Ukrainian state now is about 44 million people. The majority of those identify as Ukrainian ethnically, about 70%, about 20% Russian, and the other 10% a variety of other things. But language patterns depend a lot on where in Ukraine you live. So if you live in the western part of Ukraine, next to Poland or next to Slovakia, you almost certainly speak Ukrainian at home and grew up speaking Ukrainian. If you lived in Crimea or in the eastern part next to the Russian border, whether you're identified as Ukrainian or Russian or not, you probably spoke Russian both at home and out and about in your daily life. Within Crimea itself, about 68% of the population identifies as ethnically Russian, about 20% Ukrainian, and about 10 or 15% are a Turkic group known as the Crimean Tatars. But almost everyone spoke Russian as their primary native language. Okay?
Thank you very much.
All right? So I'm going to suggest that both of these dichotomies between pragmatist and ideologue are too simplified, and I'm going to give you about a minute of social science theory, if we can handle that, okay? So this is a guy named Max Weber. He's a famous German sociologist writing about 100 years ago, and in his magnum opus, it's called Economy and Society, he had a section where he talked about, well, what motivates people to do what they do, right? Most social scientists, especially economists, but also political scientists, like to talk about instrumental rationality. So people do what they want to advance their interests. Okay, so people are self-interested, they pursue greater wealth or greater power or greater influence, whatever their goal is, they work to pursue that in a very kind of rational way. But Weber said there are three other primary explanations for why people do what they do. And the second one he called value rationality, but I think it's simpler to think of simply as ideas. They have beliefs that they try and actualize in their life about what's good, what's not good, and what they want to promote as they go through life. People often also have emotions, what he called affect, right? So their feelings determine what they do. So when you're deciding who you're in love with, you don't sit down and pull out a spreadsheet and do a cost-benefit analysis, right? It's a feeling that you have inside you somewhere. And then a lot of people just do things because that's what they've done, right? You get habits, and I don't mean necessarily like smoking or something like that, but just your routines that you don't even really think about as you go through life. It's just the normal way to do things. He talked about it as tradition, but I think it's useful also to think about it as habit. So what I suggest in this, what I suggest in this book that I'm finishing that's coming out next year is that if we think about the parts of Putin's worldview or mentality that aren't just about advancing his sort of short-term rational interests, he has a series of ideas, a series of habits, and a series of emotions that are driving his behavior. And I also suggest in the book that his close circle of associates, people he's known for decades, have a similar worldview for the most part. Okay? And I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, and the boundaries between them kind of blur together, but I'm going to suggest there are certain ideas, habits, and emotions that sort of make up what I would call a code or mentality and explain the way he sees the world. So I don't want to talk about each of those. I want to talk about a couple of them in more detail. Everyone was waiting for this photo, right?
Nice horse.
What's that? I missed that.
Nice horse.
Nice horse, yeah. Nice leader too there, right? So the most important idea for Vladimir Putin and those people around him is about the power of the state and the power of the Russian state. So even before he became president, at the end of 1999, he wrote a manifesto where he talked about how a strong state is essential for Russia. It's not an anomaly, it's not something to fight against, but on the contrary is the source and guarantor of order, the initiator and driving force of any change. And he contrasted this with Great Britain or the United States, where oftentimes people have a more skeptical view of the government and the state, right? They worry about big government and an overpowerful state. In political theory terms, we would call it liberalism of the old-fashioned kind, right? Russians don't worry about that, was Putin's claim. They believe the state has to be the motor of what's going on in society, rather than a more American view which sees the state or the government as responding to society. And he went on to say in his first sort of speech as president, Russia from the very beginning was created as a super centralized state. It is fixed in her genetic code, her traditions, the mentality of the people. I'm not a biologist, but I doubt if biologists are ever going to find a statist gene somewhere, right? But his point here is that Russians have grown up with this tradition, and they tend to see the world as one in which a strong state is really important. And this strong state has to be strong not only internally, in terms of managing Russia's internal affairs, but also externally. So he links in his mind the idea of a strong state at home and a strong Russia abroad. And in Russian, there are actually two different words for these different types of statism, one that's internally focused and one that's about being a great power. So he says, all of our historical experience shows that a country like Russia can live and develop in its existing borders only if it is a great power. In all periods when the country was weak, politically or economically, Russia always and inevitably faced the threat of collapse. So if he allows the state to be weak at home, it's also going to be weak abroad, and others will take advantage of that, and the state suffers the risk of collapse. This one, I would say, is more controversial. Everyone, I think, who studies Putin agrees he's a statist, but there's a debate about really whether he's anti-Western or anti-American or not. So it might be better not to say anti-American, but suspicious of American motives. And I think this is also pretty long-standing. So most of you probably remember this horrific event in September 2004 called the Beslan Massacre. So there was a school in southern Russia where Islamic terrorists took over the school and held all these kids and their teachers and families in the school for 3 days. And this terrorist attack ended with an attempt to storm it, and 300 people died, more than half of them children. Horrific tragedy. And Putin went on television a few days later to address the nation. And the surprising thing to many people watching is he never mentioned Chechnya, the republic in the southern part of Russia that's been the seat of a sort of secessionist movement and then terrorist incidents really since the Soviet Union collapsed. And the person who was responsible for the attack in Beslan was one of these Chechen radicals. Okay? But he didn't talk about that. He said he didn't say who they was, but I'm going to infer who the they is here, want to cut from us a tasty piece of pie. Others are helping them. They help because they believe that Russia, as one of the world's great nuclear powers, still represents some kind of threat. And this threat must be eliminated. Terrorism, of course, is only an instrument for achieving these goals. So here he's suggesting that the United States was working with Islamic terrorists from within Russia to try and weaken them. And we know that this quote is referring to the United States because he has later said explicitly that he talked to George W. Bush about his belief that the CIA was helping the Islamic terrorists in southern Russia. Okay? I actually don't think that's true. If you're wondering, I actually don't think that's true, but I do think he believes this. I don't think it's just propaganda, because there was no reason after this incident to start talking about the United States. And then a few years later, in 2007, he said, "In our time, threats are not diminishing. In these new threats, as during the time of the Third Reich, are the same contempt for human life and the same claims of exceptionality and diktat in the world." Again, he didn't mention anyone by name here, but when he talks about exceptionalism, he's talking about the United States and how the United States likes to claim that it has an exceptional status as the leader of the world order and that sort of thing. So it drives him crazy that the Americans seem to arrogate to themselves this role as leader of the world. So crazy that he compares the United States to Nazi Germany, okay, in this speech. All right. So those are a couple of ideas, but I don't think that's all that's going on here. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of his upbringing and what were important to him as he was growing up. So one thing you probably know about the guy is that he's a judo black belt. And if you read the campaign biography that came out in 2000 when he was first running for president, he says he was a street punk until he was about 12. And then he got interested in the martial arts, and that set him on the right path in life. Then after that, he went on to law school. So one biographer of Putin wrote, "The law appealed to Vladimir as martial arts did. It imposed rules and order, which he came to respect more than any ideology." So this biographer says, and I tend to agree, that he's not really an ideologue, but he does have this belief in rules and order that explains the way he operates. And these are two Russian journalists who write about the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service. It's the successor to the KGB. If the FSB has an ideology, it is the goal of stability and order. And one thing everyone knows about Vladimir Putin is he used to be in the KGB, right? So in 1975, he joined the KGB, and he was brought up in this ethos, right? This atmosphere of the importance of stability and order. This is a comment from a Russian sociologist. What is disorder in the eyes of a man in uniform? It's the absence of control. And then she refers to a group she calls the siloviki. That's a term in Russian that refers to people who have a background or a career in the military, the police, or the Secret Service. So in Russian, they call them the power ministries. They're people who wear uniforms and have guns, basically. So people, in uniform perceive the presence of alternative centers of power in the country as a threat to the country's integrity. And this is one of my favorite Putin quotes. I think it's really revealing. He was asked in this press conference in 2007 about his sort of very hands-on management style. And he said, "We can only go away from that when our legal and economic and social basis develops and becomes stable. Then we won't need manual control." Right? And the reporter asked, "Well, when will that be?" Right? And he says, "In 15 or 20 years." Right? So that would put us, by the way, around 2022, 2027, and if he's reelected president next year, he will serve until 2024. Okay, so he'll have been in power for 25 years, and he's basically saying, we need someone who's really hands-on for the next 10 to 15 years. And he doesn't really trust in the institutions of government in Russia to sort of function on their own. He doesn't think they're stable enough, so it's his job as president to make sure everything holds together. All right, finally, I want to talk briefly about emotions. That's my ringtone too. All right. It's really important to Vladimir Putin, and he talks about this from when he was a young kid, about the need to feel respected. And in 2000, he was being interviewed by a Russian journalist, and they were talking about whether the IMF would give them more loans, and if there'd be conditions on these loans, and doesn't that show that the IMF doesn't respect Russia? And he said, anyone who offends us will not last 3 days. Wow. This guy, Gauntmacher, he's a Russian economist who's been an advisor to the Russian government, and so worked closely inside the Kremlin. He says both Putin and his closest circle are overcome with feelings of humiliation and betrayal. And that feelings of humiliation and betrayal are about the West, about how the West, after the Cold War ended and Russia became an independent state, took advantage of Russian weakness in the 1990s to expand its power in traditional Russian spheres of influence. So they feel the West, for a decade, was humiliating them, and it's their job to reverse that. Yeah.
Well, doesn't that have some basis in, in the Russians fight in Chechnya? Because at that point, the West, was critical of Russian action in Chechnya. Even after the bombings in Beslan, and even after the apartment house in Moscow Opera. I may be conflating the time period. I'm not really good on timeline. Actually, I'm not really good on much, and my only claim to not knowing anything about Russia is I watch the Americans on TV. And also, I'm reading one book by a guy named Stephen Lee Myers, about Putin also. Yeah. But isn't that sense of abandonment have some validity, vis-a-vis the United States? Because, we really, all we did was condemn the Russians for putting down what was essentially a really virulent, terrorist uprising in Russia. That was really pretty bad, killing children, bombing taking over the Moscow Opera House. Numerous acts. And I think the other question I have is the terrorist leader you were referring to earlier, and pardon my labeling, Basayev, is that the?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
that was Basayev. He's dead now. He was killed in a Russian government action, although maybe it was a mistake. It's a long story. In 2006. But to answer your first question, I would basically say, how much time do you have? Because the Russians could give you a long list of things that they're annoyed at the Americans about since the end of the Cold War. About the economic advice that was given by the US, they see as having been harmful. I don't actually agree with that, but that's how they see it, right? Because the economic advisors showed up at the time that the economy was tanking. So in people's minds, the two things are linked, right? The Americans, as you were pointing out, are always telling them they're doing democracy wrong, they're not respecting human rights. And then there's all the foreign policy stuff. NATO expansion, the war in Iraq, pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that existed since 1972 and George W. Bush pulled out of, revolutions that took place around Russia that they saw as the US helping to sort of promote and sponsor. So there's a long list of things that they feel that they've been either humiliated about or betrayed, and now they're saying, now that we're not so weak anymore, we're not going to stand for that, basically. Yes, sir.
I don't know many Russians, but we speak with them, people here, that's my contact. There's great respect for Putin because he's strong.
Right.
That's what you hear. And these are people who've been living here for years.
Yeah.
Great, and you see what's happening where people get murdered, with journalists get murdered because of perceived internal threat. The people in Russia support that. Are they concerned about these things that we see, where journalists are killed, where people who are opponents of the regime just disappear?
It depends on who you talk to again. But I would note that many of these episodes that you're talking about, journalists, opposition figures, that sort of thing, it's hard to pin it specifically on anything Putin said or did or wanted in most cases, okay? There's one case that I think is pretty clear that he was behind it, but many of the most prominent cases, it either seems that it happened for other reasons, or, and this is more likely in some of the most prominent cases, prominent journalists or opposition figures being killed, someone close to Putin arranged it without his say-so. And since this is off the record, there's a specific guy, his name is Kadyrov, he's the leader of the Chechen Republic now, and Putin has put a lot of faith in him to clamp down on what's going on there. And he succeeded in that using very brutal methods. And it's widely believed that both the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who was sort of well-known Russian opposition journalist, who was killed in 2006, and then an opposition politician named Boris Nemtsov, who was killed 2 years ago within eyesight of the Kremlin. Most people who study it think Kadyrov ordered both of those murders, and Putin basically feels like he can't punish him for that because he's the one who's in charge of making sure that Chechnya is under control. And if they pulled him away, things would just get worse again. So it's sort of done a deal with the devil here. Okay? But whether average Russians care about this, yes and no. I mean, there's a hardcore sort of 15% anti-Putin, sort of 15-20% anti-Putin who are really upset by all these things. But like most average people, most Russians are getting on with their lives, worrying about their families, their work, and politics is something that happens up there. It's a dirty business, and I don't want to think about it too much. All right. And this is from another former Putin advisor. Putin was one of those who were passively waiting for the moment for revanche up till the end of the 1990s. So revenge or reassertion. Right? By revanche, I mean the resurrection of the great state in which we had lived and to which we had become accustomed. We didn't want another totalitarian state, of course, but we did want one that could be respected. The state of the 1990s was impossible to respect. So there were a group of people of Putin's generation who started their career in the Soviet Union, who felt humiliated and betrayed by the Soviet collapse and the weakness of Russia in the 1990s, and who have made it their mission to make Russia great again, right? Sounds like a familiar slogan, right? You could imagine him with a cap, make Russia great again. And I actually think you can buy them in Russian. I'm going to see if I can find one when I'm there in a few weeks.
And it's got to be red.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip over some of this. But what it means for, oops, let me go back one. For domestic politics, it means a lot of centralization of power within the office of the presidency in Russia and a weakening of other spheres of government, the legislature, the courts, and non-government spheres like the media and opposition groups. It means a lot of control to those people within his tight circle, informally. And for foreign policy, it means that Russia sees itself as being a besieged fortress with external opponents working with internal enemies to try and undermine Russia. And we see that in the response in Crimea in particular. So let's skip over the domestic politics stuff. Let's talk about foreign policy. So this guy, Nikolai Patrushev, he's head of the he's head of the Security Council. He also is from Leningrad, which is where Putin is from, and he also joined the KGB in the 1970s. So they've known each other a long time. He's one of his closest associates. And 2 years ago, he said the Americans are trying to drag Russia into an interstate military conflict using the Ukrainian events to bring about a change in power in Russia and in the final analysis dismember our country. Okay? And the reason the US wants to dismember Russia, according to this worldview, and we saw this kind of reflected in the quote from Putin after Beslan, is that they want to weaken, the US government wants to weaken Russia as a potential threat, especially because it's a big nuclear power, and also to get his hands on Russia's natural resources. Okay. Yes, sir.
Is the domino theory still alive and well with the CIA and the State Department?
Say a bit more about what you mean.
Well, I'm going back to the times of Vietnam and Laos,
Right.
when they thought if one turned over, the dominoes would all
Sure.
fall, and therefore we have to start intervening in these different areas, different countries to prevent that.
I don't think that the CIA was behind the revolution in Ukraine, right? I don't think we, the US government, is trying to do what the Russian government says we're trying to do. In some sense, the domino theory is alive in Moscow, right? Because the Russian government believes that if countries that surround it, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, are allowed to leave its orbit, that eventually the US will also try to undermine their government. So I would say the domino theory is more alive there than it is here, although it might be alive here in certain ways too, right? But that's sort of a separate issue, yeah.
It seems to me that when the U.S. put the anti-missile defense system into Poland and countries like that, and NATO began to expand. I mean, they consider Montenegro as a country they want in NATO, I mean, as an example. That things worsened at that point. Is that too simplistic of you?
Again, there was a long list of things that all add up for them. It wasn't just one specific event, I would say. It was the things I listed earlier. It was NATO expansion, it was US involvement in Russian internal economic and political reforms and support for NGOs there. It was the war in Iraq, it was missile defense, it was lots of things, okay? Lots of things where they thought the US was working to undermine Russian interests, okay? And let me be clear here, I'm not saying that Vladimir Putin is crazy, quite the opposite. I'm saying from our point of view, we need to understand how the world looks from where he sits, okay? And even though our frame of reference is very different than his, I think it explains a lot of their behavior. So I wanted to move on and talk a bit about the whole crisis over Ukraine that brought us to the current state of affairs. So if you can go back to 2013, the issue was that after the end of the Cold War, the European Union, along with NATO, started to expand into countries that used to be part of the Soviet and Communist bloc. So countries like Poland, countries like Romania, countries like Hungary were asked to join both NATO and the European Union, and these three republics up here, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that had been part of the Soviet Union from the 1940s until 1991. So once this expansion process started, it was never clear, I don't think in the mind of Western policymakers, what the ultimate limit of expanding NATO and the EU was. It seemed pretty clear that having Russia in these organizations was, if at all possible, in the distant future, right? So just to take one example, if Russia were a member of NATO at some point, that would mean all of us are obligated to come to Russia's defense if Russia gets in a war with China. Okay. It seems unlikely the US is going to make that commitment to the Russians anytime in our lifetime, my lifetime, anyone else's lifetime in this room, right? Once we started moving, what's the natural border? Well, the Russians were afraid that the natural border of all these expansions was right up to their borders, right? Bringing in former Soviet republics like Ukraine, like Georgia, and so on. And at first they were mainly concerned about NATO, but then they got concerned about the European Union as well because of what it meant for Russian economic interests in these countries. Okay, so back in 2013, the European Union was pushing what they called association agreements with some of the former Soviet countries, and Russia was promoting what it called the Eurasian Union. And some countries signed up for it, like Belarus and Kazakhstan, and other countries like Moldova, the one that's in white there, and Ukraine and Georgia had suggested they were going to sign this association agreement with the European Union. The leader of Ukraine at the time, a guy named Yanukovych, had said that he was going to sign this agreement with the EU. But as it got closer to the date that it was supposed to be signed in November 2013, he came under considerable pressure from Putin to not sign. And Putin offered him a deal on natural gas prices, and he offered him a $5 billion loan. Okay? So this guy is sitting there looking at cheap natural gas, lots of money, I'm up for election next year, versus the European Union. They weren't offering membership in the European Union. They were offering, sign this pile of documents about this high and remake your legal system, your regulatory system, your economic system, and eventually we might do things like give you visa-free travel to the EU even though you can't join, right? So the EU is offering short-term pain for alleged medium-term gain, and Russia is offering immediate economic benefits. He took the immediate economic benefits. But many people in Ukraine didn't agree with him because they saw this as moving Ukraine away from their ideal future, which was association with Europe. And it led to these events that you probably recall from a few years ago, where protests started, the police tried to disperse the protesters, more protesters showed up. This dragged on for months in the middle of winter, right, in Kiev. So it's really cold out there, but all these people are out there, and eventually it degenerates into considerable violence in which over 100 people die. The police run away, and the Ukrainian president runs away to Russia. Okay? So this new group comes to power not because they were elected, but because the street protests became so large and so confrontational towards the government that eventually they won and overwhelmed the government. From the point of view of Putin, this was a coup, right? This was not a revolution. We call it a revolution. The Russians call it a coup, in an armed seizure of power, and he thinks the Americans were behind it. American employees of some laboratory conducting experiments like on rats, not understanding the consequences of what they were doing. Okay? In the fall of 2013, Barack Obama had a lot on his plate that had nothing to do with Ukraine, so I don't think the Americans planned that. But once the protests started, the Americans said the traditional things the Americans always say about we support freedom of assembly, we support the right for free determination, we support democracy, and that was seen as a symbol by the Kremlin that the Americans were really behind this revolution and promoting it. And in some ways, the US has been promoting democracy, human rights, rule of law in that part of the world for the last 25 years. We call it democracy promotion, and the Russians conceive of it as externally sponsored regime change. Okay, same programs, right? So we give money to train political parties on their campaigns, right? We do that all over the world, and we think that's promoting democracy. Russia thinks that's trying to overthrow a government that's friendly to them. And if you ask the Russian elite, 75% of the Russian elite agree with that view, that the Americans were behind the events in Ukraine. And they think there's a long history of this. So this is 2000. In 2003, this is the Georgian president at the time, Mikhail Saakashvili. There was a revolution that overthrew the government there. Saakashvili came to power. He went to law school at Columbia, right? He was seen as very pro-Western. In 2004, there was another revolution in Ukraine, also in the winter. Those crazy Ukrainians, every 10 years, they go out on the square in the middle of winter for several months and overthrow their government. So Yulia Tymoshenko became prime minister. They were seen as pro-Western in both of those countries. The Russians thought the Americans were behind it. And again, the Americans were behind it in this very loose sense, right, of having been engaged in democracy promotion in that part of the world since the early 1990s. And then when protests broke out in Russia in 2011, this was after parliamentary elections in which the US government said that the elections were fraudulent. And most outside observers believed they were too, right? That the Russian pro-Kremlin parties stole about 15% of the vote through various methods. And Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State at the time. And she made this statement about fraudulent elections, and Putin said a week after that, opposition leaders heard the signal and with the support of the US State Department began active work. right? So Clinton says these elections weren't fair, and then from Putin's point of view, that's a symbol for the State Department to start promoting protests inside Russia. So if you wonder why Vladimir Putin didn't want Hillary Clinton elected president, it goes back at least to 2011, okay? So let's skip that. So why did they go into Crimea in 2014 after the government fell? Part of it has to do with NATO expansion, and this is a map of NATO expanding to the east. NATO had said back in 2008 that at some point in the future, Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. And the Russians really thought that would be a direct threat to their security. Their Black Sea Fleet is actually based in Crimea. It was based there while Ukraine controlled Crimea on a lease agreement, and they thought after the revolution or coup in Ukraine 3 years ago that they would be pushed out of the Black Sea Fleet. And the issue that came up earlier, 60% of the population of Crimea is ethnically Russian. And they had this history of where Russia had historically controlled Crimea. So there were all those self-interested reasons, but I also think the guy was just, if I can use a colloquialism, pissed off, right? He felt the West had been pushing him around for years, and this was the last straw. And so this is a Russian analyst saying, it was not the unification of territory as such, it was the redemption of his own humiliation. Putin tolerated humiliation from the West for many years. He annexed Crimea driven by the full might of his humiliation. So there were reasons of national interest from Putin's point of view, but I also think he was emotionally just upset about how he felt he'd been treated and how Russia had been treated and was going to get his own back. They also feel the same way about the Arab Spring. I want to skip past that. Oops. So, to the question at the beginning, is he a pragmatist or an ideologue? He's a person, right? He's got ideas, he's got interests, he's got habits, he's got emotions, and he thinks he's playing defense. He thinks the West, and the Americans in particular, are out to get him and out to get Russia, and he's fighting back. Given all that, the prospects for great relations, I think, are pretty low, okay, unfortunately. Because I agree with Trump, it would be a wonderful thing if we could have better relations with Russia. I don't see it in the offing at the moment. All right, so that's all been really depressing, right? But now I want to tell you that we shouldn't freak out here. This is not the Cold War, again, because Russia is not the Soviet Union, right? It is much weaker than the United States and Europe, and it's much weaker than China, which is very different than the time during the Cold War. All right, so Russia has many obvious strengths. It's the world's biggest country, right? Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has lots of oil and gas, so it's about 15% of world oil and natural gas production, which gives it lots of influence. Has lots of nuclear weapons, same number as the US, several thousand. And it has really good female tennis players. So it has some strengths. But the big story over the last 30 years is the collapse of Russian power. So this quote is from a historian who teaches at Cambridge. Russia is now weaker now than it has been at almost any time in the last 300 years. So I had my research assistant put together a graph going back to the time of Peter the Great in 1700 of Russia as a percentage of global population and as a percentage of the global economy. And Levin is right? 300 years ago, Russia was roughly 4% of world population and world economy. And I should say that these numbers up until 1991 reflect the territory that Russia controlled at the time. So the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, and now post-Soviet Russia. So Russia grows throughout the 19th century. By the middle of the 20th century, it's about 10% of world economy and about 8% of world population. 1991 hits, half of the population of the Soviet Union becomes independent in other countries, like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, etc. Half of the economy goes away, and then the economy continues to decline as Russia makes this transition from communism to capitalism. So at the time Vladimir Putin comes to power, Russia is 2% of world population and 2% of the world economy. And if we project outward, their population is going to continue to decline as a share of world population. Okay? So it is true that Russia is weaker now than it has been any time in the last 300 years. The other big story, other than the decline of Russia, is the rise of China. So if you think of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, this is the biggest global power shift. Russia declines. This is as a percentage of global population, starting here. Right, it starts slowly and then collapses in 1991. And China, starting in the late 70s, starts to rise. So now China is now about 20% of world GDP, and Russia is about 2% of world GDP. That's the major power shift that's happened, and that people like Putin are trying to sort of respond to. So if we look at world military spending, right, everyone's concerned about the Russian military in Ukraine, the Russian military in Syria, and they're doing a lot with a little, but they're 4% of world military spending. The United States is 36% of world military spending, so we spend 9 times as much on our military as Russia does. And most of the other countries on this list are American allies, right? Saudi Arabia, France, UK, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Italy, Australia, Brazil, Israel, even United Arab Emirates, I would say. So most world military spending is the US and its allies, and Russia is a tiny fraction of that. The other thing that's happened under Putin is they had a huge economic boom and it's collapsed. Okay? So from 1999 to 2008, the Russian economy grew at about 7% a year. Very good growth rates, although more or less average for that part of the world actually during that time frame. But then there was the global recession of 2008, 2009. They started to recover, and then they went into recession again when world oil prices collapsed again in 2014. Now, this looks a bit over dramatic because it's going based on translating rubles into dollars at the current exchange rate. But by this number, Russia in 2016 has fallen back to where they were in about 2006. Okay? Now, if we look at it just in rubles, the process is not nearly quite as dramatic, but the overall trend is still the same, whereas in 2016, they're back about where they were in 2008. Right? So they've had 8 straight years of basically little to no growth. Okay? So the Vladimir Putin that we saw in the 2000s thought this was going to go on and on, right? Oil and gas money was going to pour in. They could pour it into their military. They could also pour it into domestic needs. That has stagnated, okay? And the one thing I think that keeps people in the Kremlin awake more at night than anything is, are oil prices going to recover? And can we get our economy moving again? Because they can't achieve their goals either at home or abroad if their economy is not growing. Yeah?
Besides vodka, oil, and caviar, what does Russia export?
It's citizen.
You are not a plant. I want everyone to know that. We're going to go to the next slide and we will address this question. So, in 2003, a survey was done in the US. What items do people associate with Russia? What do you associate with Russia? Vodka. Everyone says vodka. What else?
Caviar.
Caviar.
They sell a lot of weapons lately.
Okay, well, not just what they produce. Just what comes into your mind when you think Russia?
Armament dolls.
Oil. What?
Armament.
Oh, Matryoshka dolls. All right. These are the results from the survey. Communism, the KGB, snow, and the mafia. All right. So, not a great image. And I tried to dig into the data behind this because this was just reported in the press, because I'm like, why is vodka not in the list? Because every time I ask people this question, vodka is #1 on the list. And here it's not even in the top 4 for some reason. So there must have been a mistake. But putting vodka aside, right, Russia's image abroad is not that great. And then you ask the question, what do they produce? So can you name any Russian brands? What? Stolichnaya, a vodka brand. What? Slivovitz, okay. But we don't think of, right, Honda, Toyota, LGE, GE, lots of sort of brands globally, German brands we could come up with. Kalashnikov, right? So the rifles.
Airplanes.
And this is a good one. Molotov cocktail. And if you don't know what a Molotov cocktail is, it's not a brand, okay? So people can't think, what do the Russians produce? Because 85% of their exports are raw materials: oil, gas, timber, diamonds, metals. Okay?
And military weapons.
And military weapons, and nuclear power plants, okay? But they don't produce consumer goods that sell well outside the country, right? They're not famed for, things that you and I would buy, right? They just haven't managed to make the leap to the modern information economy or even 21st century industrial production. Now, they do seem to have some people who are very good at computers, right? But that's on the software side, and even on the software side, in the hacking side, they're not really competing with the Americans. So, yeah, go ahead.
Have any of the big automakers, you mentioned Toyota, Honda, and so forth, have any of them made inroads as far as building plants in Russia? Well, they have.
Yeah, lots of them have built plants inside Russia producing for the Russian market. Okay, but there have been some efforts to protect Russian car manufacturers from imports, but Russian consumers don't want to buy Russian cars for the most part. I mean, some do, but not enough to compete with the outside sellers, right? German and Japanese cars are more popular in Russia than Russian cars, and no one outside of Russia buys Russian cars, right? Can you walk onto a car lot
Is there a
in the
Russian
U.S. and
car?
buy a Russian car? Yeah, there are Russian cars, but they're mainly for domestic, sales. They're not sold internationally. Yeah, you had a question, right?
Yes, what we hear about the sanctions.
Yeah.
What role have the sanctions played as far as the
economy? The biggest thing by far has been the decline in world oil prices. So between 2011 and 2014, the average price of a barrel of oil was over $100. Now it's like between 40 and 50, and it's been there for the last 2-3 years or so. So that's been the biggest change. The sanctions are important in that they target certain parts of the financial sector, certain parts of Russian defense industry, and certain parts of the Russian oil industry. Economists estimate that the sanctions may have had the effect of knocking off about 0.5 to 1% of GDP a year, which in terms of total number is a big number of rubles, but in terms of a percentage of the economy, it's not that huge, right? In terms of the effect on average Russians, the biggest impact of the sanctions are what the Russian government's response to the sanctions. So in response to the Western sanctions, Russia stopped food imports from countries that were sanctioning them, so especially the EU, but also the US. And what that has meant is inflation in food prices inside Russia. So the economy in 2016 declined by about 1.5% in Russia, the year before by about 3.5%, but living standards declined by about 10% on an annual basis. And that's something the Russians really haven't experienced since the 1990s, because even when the world financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, the Russian government had a big pile of foreign currency sitting around that they pumped into their banks to keep the economy going. So they had one big year of GDP decline, but they insulated their population from the effects of that, and then world energy prices picked up and they started to do somewhat better. So the last 2 years is really the first time that Russian pocketbooks have really been hit. So sort of the $20,000 question or $64,000 question for Russia experts is, will the polls, in terms of support for Putin, catch up with the pocketbook? And the way people have talked about it is they say it's a race between the television and the refrigerator. So on the television, they hear of the great exploits of Russia in the world and the great exploits of Vladimir Putin to keep Russia strong and respected in the world. And then they look in their refrigerator and they don't have the foodstuffs that they had before, and they can't afford the food they could buy before. There is some evidence that it's starting to catch up with them. So Putin's favorability rating remains very high, but one of the things that happened after the annexation of Crimea, there was this big patriotic outburst in Russia, and not only Putin became more popular, everything associated with the Russian government became popular. Right? The prime minister became more popular, the parliament became more popular, the military became more popular, even the police became more popular, and the police in Russia are perceived as being very corrupt. But everything became more popular. Now what we're seeing is Putin is still popular, but the rest of the government much less so. Right? And so that's one reason the Russian government is very worried about the presidential elections coming next year and the protests we've seen over the last month. Will this start to spread, and will it affect Putin himself? I actually don't think so, because Putin in the polls, if you ask a Russian, do you support Putin or not, it's sort of asking, do you support Russia or not, or do you love your grandmother, right? It would just be a betrayal to say you don't support Russia, because he's the symbol of the country. But everything else about the government they're upset about. Yeah.
Hasn't he also stacked up well against other Russian leaders that they had since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 or whatever? I mean, hasn't they had experiences of other leaders like Yeltsin and some others?
Yeltsin. Yeah.
No, but weren't there some others too? Who was the guy who died like after a year or something?
Well, it went from Gorbachev in 1991 when the Soviet Union ended to Yeltsin, who was president until the end of 1999, and then since then it's been basically Putin. There was the 4-year period when Medvedev was president and Putin was prime minister, but basically Putin has been in charge for the last 17,
So that's a
18
limited
years.
comparison. I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah, but it is true that one of the ways that Putin acquired his popularity early on, and has really kept it, is by being the anti-Yeltsin, right? So when Putin came on the scene, he was young, he was strong, he was healthy, he was sober, right? And Yeltsin was seen as being the opposite of all of those things. And the economy really suffered in the 1990s, and I actually don't think that Yeltsin is primarily responsible for that. I think the two main things that explain that are the shift from communism to capitalism caused a recession throughout the post-communist world, right? So it was inevitable that there was going to be a recession. It was just how long and how deep. But the other thing is world energy prices in the 90s were like $10 to $15 a barrel, right? And after Putin became president, they started to go up slowly, but then they just took off around 2004, 2005 and got up to over $100 a barrel, as I mentioned earlier. So Yeltsin is very unpopular in Russia, as is Gorbachev, and Putin is very popular. But a lot of it has to do with things outside of anyone's control. But if you're an average person, it's like, am I living better now or worse than I lived before? And for most Russians, the answer for most of the Putin period has been, I'm living better. It's only in the last 2 years where the answer has been, I'm not living as well as I was before. And one of the questions is, how long can Putin run against the legacies of the 90s and Yeltsin, saying, I restored order, I brought back growth, I raised living standards? Well, that works for a while, but does it work for 18 years, right? Yeah, there's a question back there.
Yeah, I think that very unfortunate Russia has lost the bad image there, but I think that this slide has a little bit misleading to people about the understanding about Russia. The reason is because Russia and China, they both are a communist country. The communist country, their economy is a planning economy. They are not like us. We are a capitalism. Everybody can think to do something you want, and then you can produce something. But in Russia, they don't need to do that. If you see this slide and you see nothing from the Russians give us an image about their plan, I can ask you another question. What do you think? which brand in the mainland China today, they bring to you. That means in the United States, we see which of the brand or the produce something from mainland China is in our image. Nothing. Everything they do is they use their cheap labor trying to help capitalism to building this wall. And so we can enjoy the cheap product. The question is, Russian, they are not open their market. By another way to say is, they don't let their people be slaved by the capitalists. If they do, I tell you, today you will see a lot of the Russian thing coming to the United States. That's the difference. So that's the reason I think United States don't understanding these three superpowers: Russia, United States, and mainland China. So that's the reason I personally feel that Hillary make a big mistake. It's 2011, and she doesn't like the Russian, okay? But also she come to the Southern Asian, trying to coming back to the Asia, trying to surrounding the mainland China. Actually give a good opportunity of the Russia and China combined together. When these two superpowers combine together, I tell you, that is a destroy of the United States. That's my personal view.
Okay, so a couple of comments in response. So, Russia and China did have communist economies, but they don't so much anymore. Russia totally went away from it in 1991, and China, even though the Communist Party still rules, they've embraced capitalism as well, right? But at the time this happened, Russia and China were at very different stages in terms of economic development. Russia, under the Soviet Union, had become a modern industrial power in many respects, but they had never, as you point out, during the communist period, needed to open themselves up to international markets. But after 1992, their goal was to integrate with the global economy, but they have been much less successful at doing that than China has been at doing that in terms of attracting foreign investment, in terms of producing for international markets. So China produces a lot for international markets. Russia produces oil and gas and timber and diamonds, which, you know, produces perhaps the wrong word, but they extract and export. And I don't think it's because the Russian government doesn't want their people to be slaves. I think they don't create the conditions in which foreign investors want to put their money in there. Now, I guess from one point of view, we could say that's enslavement to international capital. But from the point of view of people's living standards going up because other countries and other companies are investing in them, it's generally, I would say, a more positive thing. And then one final point about sort of Russia-China-US relations. China and Russia do have pretty good relations right now because to a large extent they both oppose the US having this role as the global sort of superpower, and they disagree with US foreign policy about intervention in Iraq and intervention in other parts of the world. So they agree on that, but their trajectories are to a certain extent at odds with each other, right? China is expanding its influence in Central Asia, which is traditionally an area of Russian influence, and it seems clear that China is going to win that competition, if we think of it as a competition, in terms of investment, in terms of control over markets in that part of the world. So in the long run, the Russians are worried about the Americans, but they're also going to be worried about the Chinese, whose economy is much more powerful and who live right next door and have a much larger population. Yeah, the gentleman here had a question.
How did Putin in 10 years get from Leipzig to the presidency of Russia?
So in 1989, he was not in Leipzig, but in Dresden, in East Germany, right, working for the KGB. And after, one of the things that people point to in terms of shaping his worldview, there was this moment in 1989. So we all remember the revolutions of 1989 that hit Poland and Hungary and East Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So Putin is working for the KGB in Dresden, and when the protests start in East Germany, a group of protesters come to the building where the East German secret police are, and the Soviet secret police, the KGB, are also there. And the building is surrounded, and the KGB and Vladimir Putin are burning documents as fast as they can. He says the furnace broke at one point. They were trying to destroy all the documents before the building got stormed. And they called the local Soviet military base, because the Soviet military had troops in East Germany, obviously, at the time, and said, can you send some troops to protect us? And the answer that they got back was, we called Moscow, and Moscow was silent. And that really stuck with Vladimir Putin. Like, the state just gave up on protecting its interest and its people as far as he was concerned. So in 1990, he goes back to Leningrad at the time, and actually he's temporarily driving a taxi, all right? But he happens to have friends who know the guy who's the rising mayor of Leningrad that then becomes St. Petersburg, and he's someone that he'd actually met in law school too, a guy named Anatoly Sobchak. And he goes to work for Sobchak, and Sobchak makes him his deputy mayor, responsible for economic matters and foreign matters, foreign relations. And through those networks, he meets lots of people in St. Petersburg politics, in St. Petersburg business, and he sort of starts to develop his network, but it's still a long way to the Kremlin, right? 1996, Sobchak runs for re-election and loses, right? So Vladimir Putin in 1996 is unemployed. He does not have a job. A friend of his who worked for the mayor had already gone to Moscow and was working for Yeltsin. And this friend arranges for Putin to get a job working for the Kremlin as well. And that's when his rise starts. So he takes several jobs in the Kremlin. Yeltsin starts to notice him. Eventually, in 1998, he puts him in charge of the FSB, the secret police. And then from there, he becomes secretary of the Security Council, and from there, he becomes prime minister. All right? So it was some real luck in terms of having a connection in the Kremlin when he lost his job in 1996, and then his own proficiency in working for Yeltsin and impressing the boss and demonstrating his loyalty to Yeltsin in some very tough moments that led Yeltsin to think, okay, I'm looking around for a successor. This guy's competent and he's loyal, and he can be trusted to not betray us once he becomes president. Because one of the things that really matters to Putin is loyalty. And he's really not, he's really very loyal to people who work for him, and has had a hard time ever cutting any of those people loose. And if he does cut them loose, he cuts them loose in a way in which they're very protected. He doesn't turn on people, and he never turned on Yeltsin, even though he disagreed with all of Yeltsin's policies, as far as we can tell. He remained loyal to him as a person and protected him and his family from those people who wanted to prosecute them for corruption after the 1990s. Yeah.
Think Snowden is still there?
Snowden is still there, we know that. Yeah, he's still in Moscow. Yeah.
Putin is clearly not necessarily paranoid about encirclement as a consequence of NATO pushing up to the borders of Russia and various other factors you've discussed. But is it realistic going forward for the model that he's implemented, an economic model primarily in Russia, to succeed over time? And will he constantly have to be implementing further and further repressive tactics in order to retain power? For example, if he has to run for re-election, is it realistic to think that an election will be fair, or will, in effect, it be a dictatorship if it is not already a dictatorship? And there'll be a further decline of petrodollars to finance their economy, a decline in population, a lot of factors that don't bode well for the future for the Russian people. So will his percentage of support, assuming polling can possibly be accurate, will that continue to diminish? And is there a point at which the Russian people might in fact rebel against the status quo?
Okay, a couple things in that question. I'll highlight two of them. One is about the economy. So I mentioned earlier about the sort of boom running out, but one of the things that's really interesting is from 2011 to 2014, the economy largely stops growing. That is at a time when world energy prices are at their highest point ever. So Russian economists were freaking out, right? Because the growth that they'd had in the 2000s when energy prices went up had stopped, even though energy prices remained high, and in fact were at all-time highs. And so most Russian economists believed that the model that they had used in the 2000s to recover was no longer viable. And they believed that the problem was the rule of law was too weak, there was too much corruption, the state played too large a role in the economy, and they were too dependent on natural resources, right? So believing those things were problems, what Russian economists were suggesting is what they call institutional reform. Okay, trying to strengthen the rule of law, trying to fight corruption, trying to give people incentive to invest, right? Trying to encourage entrepreneurship. The problem is doing all of those things, institutional reform, basically means reversing all of the political things Putin had done for the previous 11 years to concentrate power in the presidency, weaken the judiciary, weaken the media, weaken civil society, right? Because those are the things that help fight corruption and help uphold the rule of law, right? So for the last really 6 years, there's been this debate going in Russia about, among the elite, right? Can they make these institutional reforms, and if not, what are the consequences? And Putin, for the last 6 years, has always hesitated to make those reforms because he understands it implies politically putting constraints on his own power, which he has been unwilling to do. So they've been muddling along and hoping that world energy prices will recover and that will bring some more resources into the system. But they're very worried about this. So switching to the political side, he has an election coming next March, okay, where he can legally run for a 4th term as president. If he wins, he's president until 2024, by which point he will be in his 70s. Most people assume he will run, and most people who assume he will win, and all the experts, or I shouldn't say all the experts, 95% of the experts on Russian politics agree it's more or less an authoritarian model with sort of a democratic, front, right? But certain people aren't allowed into the political system if they're not considered willing to play by the rules, right? There's this oppositionist, some of you may have heard of, named Alexei Navalny, who's trying to lead the Russian opposition. He's faced a series of trumped up criminal charges. He's faced attacks on his person, right? And they're saying he's not going to be allowed to run for president. So it looks like it's going to be Putin and a couple of other parties that can be guaranteed to do worse, like the Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, which is this Zhirinovsky clown nationalist party, right? So they're going to make sure that Putin wins, and they also control the electoral process. But then the question is, what happens if the economy continues to stagnate? Because they've deprived themselves of all the institutional outlets for trying to reverse government policy, which leaves going onto the streets. And what we've seen, if we look at just labor protest over the last 3 years, it's increased a lot. And there were a series of protests in Russia in April that surprised everyone by the number of people and especially the number of places where people protested. It wasn't just Moscow and Petersburg, it was all over the country.
Number
right?
of young people.
Young people especially, yeah. So I think Putin's going to run next year. I think he's going to win. But that doesn't mean to me that he's necessarily stable until 2024. Let me show you one slide that sort of speaks to this. Come on, I lost, there we go. If in 2014 we look at countries that the World Bank qualified as high income. Okay, so the highest income countries, so that this is Western Europe, this is Japan, South Korea, the US, Canada, but it's also countries like Argentina, like Croatia, and like Russia, and a lot of oil dictatorships. If we look at these countries that are high income, yet have an authoritarian government, there aren't very many of them, because one of the more or less laws of social science is that as countries become richer, they tend to become more open politically. There's a long story about why that's true, but that tends to be the pattern. If we look at the countries that qualify as high income, most of them are petrostate monarchies. Okay? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, etc. One small African petrostate, Equatorial Guinea, which has a lot of oil and not many people, and has had a dictator there in charge for more than 20 years. And then we have one Eurasian great power, Russia. So Russia is also relatively dependent upon oil and gas like many of those countries, but not to the same extent, right? For a lot of these countries, oil and gas is it. Russia's too big a country with 140-some million people to rely just on that. Most of these countries, except for Saudi Arabia, are less than 10 million people. So the question is, Russia's an outlier, right? And Russia has the type of society that tends to be more open. People are well educated, they're urban, right? They're literate, and they're diverse in terms of their economic occupation. Even though the country depends a lot on oil and gas, most people work in services and professions, so they're teachers, doctors, lawyers, accountants, programmers, baristas, waiters, right? They're doing the sorts of things that people are doing for their livelihood in the West, and that type of openness in the economy and a well-educated population tends to go with democracy around the world. So Russia's kind of an outlier. Now, one of the things that the decline of the last 2 years has done, it drove Russia out of the high income category. So now it's upper middle income according to the World Bank, but it's still an anomaly in terms of how repressive the government is given how developed the economy is. So if you ask me sort of looking long term, I think Russia is going to be politically more open, but I can't tell you when, okay? Yeah.
And with that, I think we gotta let people go.
Okay.
And I know that we could obviously ask questions all day, so thank you so much to Dr. Taylor.